Sunak under growing pressure to warn European judges that Britain will quit the European Convention of Human Rights unless they commit to major reforms. I'm going to fess up a little bit on this one. I don't know. I'm aware of the history of the European Convention. I know that we were the kind of not just the co-signatories, we pretty much authored the piece. It goes back to Churchill. There was an obvious, compelling, urgent reason to have this post-war, as it were. It was unthinkable that you wouldn't get something down in writing, given what the world had just been to and that gargantuan near miss. So it made sense. Okay, we all get it. It kind of made sense, and here we are 70-odd years later, whatever it is, and there's a question mark over it as to whether judges now use this convention to kind of overstretch their brief a little bit. It's not meant to be about politics. It's meant to be about, like any other convention, simply applying what the convention says and the spirit of what the convention says. And if it's utilised or used against that spirit, then it's right that people call that out. And that's certainly the suspicion around what's happening with Rwanda, is the obvious example on that. Now, if there is a sniff that this is getting political rather than just simply trying to apply the law, it's understandable that any government would step in and say, look, this is not fair. This is not, we cannot have an outside jurisdiction, legally speaking, that can dictate such fundamental matters as our immigration policy. That is not the point of the convention. That's not why we signed up to the convention, not why we wrote the darn thing. So we want out, or some do, but some don't. Would you support leaving the ECHR? 0344 499 1000. And it is worth saying this, and this is, I think, largely the bit where I get confused. The British Bill of Rights, well, we have our rights. I mean, why can that not just replace the European Convention? It will pretty much be the same thing. We're not going to, if we pulled out of it, nobody's going to suddenly say, we can send you to jail as the government anytime we like. If you do something bad, I don't know, dress up as a vicar and say silly things on social media, we can put you in prison. No, it's not going to, that's not going to happen. What is going to happen is that the British will be able to say, we run this part of our system. Is there anything fundamentally wrong with that? Why does it divide the Tory party so much? And it really does. And we're talking about right-wing conservatives who say this would be a terrible thing to leave the ECHR. And it might well satisfy some people on one particular point, but we should do this at our peril. Would you support leaving it? 0344 499 1000. Let's get a word on this and a few other big stories of the day. Joe Twyman is the co-founder of the public opinion consultancy firm Delta Poll. Afternoon to you, Joe.
Good afternoon, Ian.
Have we got any data on this one as to what the kind of support levels are for the ECHR?
Yes, we have. You can ask people whether they support or oppose Britain's membership, whether they support or oppose leaving. It doesn't really matter how you vary the question in that respect. What we find is that more than half of people support the Convention on Human Rights and around about a quarter, though maybe slightly more, oppose it. So it's by a margin of 2 to 1 people do support it. But having said that, among Conservative voters, support is lower. In fact, you generally get more people opposing it than supporting it, but it's very close in that respect among Conservative voters and among voters of other parties. It's not a close deal at all, and most people support it.
Yeah, but I was going to say, Joe, sorry, do continue.
Oh, well, really important point here. Most people don't know what the European Convention on Human Rights is or what it means. And so you can ask these questions in the abstract construct of a survey instrument, but is anyone actually thinking about it at home? Probably not outside of these kind of moments where it's discussed in politics.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely spot on, Joe. And I think with, if you say to people, do you support human rights? Well, it's like, do you support being nice? Of course we all support that. But the minutiae of this argument, which is glaring in this particular case, but within the human rights, this is just one aspect. And it's that's really at stake here, isn't it? It's the idea that the Human Rights Convention is being, some would say abused, but others would say misapplied, more politely, in the case of migration. And if you ask the question that way, I wonder whether we would get a different kind of result.
Well, we're not actually talking about migration even, generally. What we're talking about are specific policies within the government's approach to migration and the fact that there are suspicions that the European Convention on Human Rights would be used. But actually, there's a lot of speculation in there, and there's very little in the way of hard evidence about what would actually happen. And so I think that most of the rhetoric that we hear, particularly from people like Suella Braverman, is actually about sabre rattling. It's about sending a message to her supporters within the party, but also the Conservative supporters in the country more generally, that the government will be, if you like, muscular and powerful and stand up for those who support their views rather than giving in to those who don't. That's what this is all about. This is about the next general election, but it's also, I might say, if I were being cynical, about Suella Braverman wanting to position herself to be the next Conservative leader if Rishi Sunak doesn't win the next election.
You think, Joe, that's not cynical? I think that's quite glaring at the moment, isn't it? And you wonder how much, because usually when other ministers, in this case the Home Secretary, give a speech somewhere, she did this thing in Washington, D.C. in the week, you're meant to run that past Downing Street. And I think with so much on their plate, they probably think, do you mind if Suella speaks about this? Yeah, it's fine. And then, of course, some say went further than number 10 would be comfortable with. Others are suggesting that actually Rishi was using this as a kind of litmus test, and she was the perfect rod, if you like, to throw out there to test the waters. We will watch with interest. Just tying into this about migration. Public concern over migration is the highest level we understand in 6 years. 26% of adults see this as one of the most important issues facing Britain. Do you think this is this the decider or one of the top 5 deciders at an election, do you sense, Joe?
I don't think it's as important as it's being presented to be. That's not to say that it's not important, but if you look at its relative importance, particularly compared to the cost of living, you see that really it's nowhere close to that. And yes, among Conservative supporters, it is higher, but Conservative supporters are not the votes that the Conservative Party needs to win. And there are very few people out there who said, oh, well, I used to vote Conservative, but I don't anymore. But now that my mortgage has gone up by a significant amount and my heating bills have doubled, I've heard that the Conservatives are doing something about migration, so I'm back on the Tory train.
Yeah.
It doesn't really work like that in real life. What's actually happening is that there are attempts being made to tie things like the environment and other subjects to the cost of living to make that relevant. But this issue is something for galvanising more of the grassroots than anything else. And apart from all of the rhetoric that we've seen, the difficulty that the Conservatives has is that, yes, it's grown in importance, but it's Labour who are currently seen as the best party to deal with it.
Isn't that interesting?
And so the Conservative solutions are not resonating with the general public, and that's a real problem for the Conservatives.
And that's an area that Labour never even used to bother getting out of bed to even debate, because they thought it's not in our DNA, it's not really what our voter base cares too much about. If we're asked in an interview, have you got an immigration policy, we'll throw something out there, but we're never ever going to be ahead on immigration. And yet here we are with Labour ahead on immigration. I mean, that's a curious place to be for them.
Yes, the difficulty that both main parties have is that actually neither is particularly preferred when it comes to specifically the subject of immigration, because neither party has answers that are seen as effective, fair, or even workable in most cases. Labour have kept relatively quiet about their position. The Conservatives have come out with lots of different things, but ultimately we expect a record level of net migration next year, which could damage any kind of sabre rattling and other words and messages that we hear from them up until then.